Let's start at the very beginning. Adolf Hitler, one of history's most infamous figures, was born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town. His early years? Well, they were marked by a lot of turbulence. His father, Alois, was strict and demanding, while his mother, Clara, was more nurturing. Not exactly the kind of balanced childhood that might offer stability, right?
Indeed. And even as a youngster, Hitler displayed a streak of rebelliousness, particularly against his father. Alois wanted him to pursue a career in customs, like himself, but young Adolf dreamed of art. He even applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but was flatly rejected twice. Those rejections crushed him, pushing him into a period of aimlessness where he struggled to support himself, painting watercolours to get by.
It's around this time, you could say, when Hitler's political passions began to simmer. Vienna wasn't just his artistic downfall, it was also a melting pot of divisive ideologies. He soaked up anti-Semitic and nationalist rhetoric, ideas that would tragically define his later beliefs.
Exactly. Now fast forward to World War I. Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian army, yes, even though he was technically Austrian, and served as a dispatch runner. Surprisingly, he loved the structure of military life and found a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. He was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, an honour he wore with immense pride.
But after the war, Germany was left in complete turmoil. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 devastated the country. Economically crippling reparations, territorial losses. Just imagine the resentment and hopelessness brewing. For Hitler, this wasn't just post-war hardship, it became personal. He blamed the treaty, the Weimar government, and, most infamously, the Jewish population.
And this resentment laid the foundation for his radical beliefs. By 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, soon to become the Nazi Party under his leadership. Hitler's fiery speeches and nationalist propaganda rapidly gained support during these years of widespread anger and insecurity.
Which brings us to that pivotal event, the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923. This was Hitler's attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government. Spoiler alert, it failed miserably. He was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he served less than a year.
But in a way, it was this very failure that became his springboard. While imprisoned, Hitler penned Mein Kampf, his political manifesto. In it, he outlined his plans for Germany's future: nationalism, expansion, and racial purity. The book was his ideological blueprint.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Sometimes the hardest setbacks become turning points. I mean, he could have been just a footnote in history after the putsch, but instead he emerged stronger and more determined.
Yes, though, let's be clear, his reasons and outcomes were utterly catastrophic. But it raises an interesting question. How do personal failures shape people's paths? You know, even in our own lives, setbacks can lead to surprising opportunities.
Absolutely. And speaking of paths, after his release, Hitler began tailoring his tactics. No more coups, he set his eyes on legal power. That brings us to the next critical phase of his rise, which we'll discuss shortly.
So after abandoning coups and opting for legal pathways, how does someone rise from the ashes of failure to secure total control of a nation? Let's explore how Hitler's calculated strategies and opportunistic moves led him to dominate Germany by 1933.
Right, and Hitler's path to the chancellorship was, to say the least, opportunistic. By leveraging the widespread economic instability caused by the Great Depression and the deeply fragmented political environment of the Weimar Republic, Hitler positioned himself as the answer to Germany's woes. His rhetoric was designed to appeal to a broad spectrum: disgruntled war veterans, the unemployed, even sections of the middle class who feared communism.
Exactly. And in 1933, his appointment as Chancellor was actually a result of political manoeuvring by conservative politicians like Franz von Papen. They thought they could control him, keep him in check. In reality, they had just opened the door for Hitler to implement his radical agenda. What
sealed the deal, though, was the infamous Enabling Act of 1933. After the Reichstag fire, which was blamed on communists, Hitler seized the opportunity to instill fear. The Nazis declared a national emergency, passed the Reichstag fire decree, and then pressured Parliament to pass the Enabling Act. This gave his cabinet the power to bypass the Reichstag entirely, effectively eliminating democracy.
Which is terrifying when you think about it. He didn't just seize power overnight with brute force. He used legal mechanisms to dismantle the Republic from within. And once he had that power, it was game over for his opposition.
It's worth noting that this totalitarian control extended to every aspect of life. Free speech? Gone. The Nazis took control of the media. Opposition parties? Banned. Even trade unions were dismantled, with workers forced to join Nazi-controlled organisations.
Let's not forget the role of propaganda. The Nazis curated a narrative that glorified Hitler as Germany's saviour. A key moment symbolising this was the 1933 book burnings, public displays where works deemed un-German were destroyed. Media censorship reinforced the regime's ideology, leaving no room for dissent.
And it wasn't just media control. Cultural manipulation played a huge role. Films, art, educational curriculums, everything was tailored to reflect Nazi ideals. This created an entire generation indoctrinated with their ideology.
It's deeply unsettling how effective these strategies were, and, it's not just historical, it's happening even today. Modern authoritarian regimes often take similar steps, control the media, stifle opposition, create fear of a common enemy.
Absolutely. We've seen this tactic repeated, though adapted to new technologies like social media. The principles remain chillingly similar: control the narrative, isolate dissenters, and instill a sense of dependency or fear amongst citizens.
Which raises a crucial question. How do societies resist this kind of manipulation? And more importantly, how did this propaganda lay the groundwork for Hitler's next steps? The answer: expansion and war. But we'll explore that in the next chapter.
Having solidified control over Germany, Hitler's next steps were driven by his imperial vision of a larger German empire, what he called Hochlebensraum, or living space. This unrelenting ambition climaxed in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, an act that was both strategic and propagandized to justify expansion, ultimately igniting the catastrophic conflict of World War II. Let's begin by examining how this invasion marked the beginning of the war.
Right. On September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland under the guise of defending German-speaking populations. This was a lie, of course. The truth was much grimmer. A large-scale invasion meticulously planned with the Soviet Union, which invaded from the east just weeks later. This decisive and devastating action forced Britain and France to declare war on Germany.
And as the war escalated, so did Hitler's inhumane policies. You've likely heard of the Holocaust, but the scale of the genocide is almost incomprehensible. Hitler's obsession with racial purity led to the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable.
The Nazi regime established a chilling apparatus of death. Concentration camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka became centres of horror. These were not just prisons, they were factories of mass murder. Gas chambers, forced labour, starvation, and horrific medical experiments were carried out there. And let's not forget, this wasn't an accident of war. It was a deliberate policy known as the final solution.
It's heartbreaking to think about the individuals caught in this tragedy. Stories like that of Anne Frank help us connect these staggering numbers to real human lives. Anne's diary, written while she and her family hid in an Amsterdam attic, gives us a haunting glimpse into the fear and hope of those persecuted. She wasn't just a statistic. She was a young girl with dreams, taken away far too soon.
Indeed, and while millions suffered, there were also acts of resistance and courage. From uprising attempts in ghettos like Warsaw to individuals who risked everything to shelter victims, these stories remind us of humanity's resilience, even in the darkest moments.
As the war dragged on, the tide began to turn. By 1944, the Allies were gaining ground, with the Soviet Union pushing from the East and the United States, Britain and others reclaiming Europe from the West. But the cost was immense. Tens of millions dead, entire cities reduced to rubble.
And at the centre of Germany's crumbling war effort was Hitler himself, entrenched in his Berlin bunker. On April 30th, 1945, as Allied forces closed in, Hitler took his own life alongside his wife, Eva Braun. It marked the end of Nazi rule, but left behind devastating scars on Europe and the world.
Reflecting on all this, we're left with an undeniable truth. History must inform the present. Understanding how unchecked hate and political manipulation led to such tragedy underscores our responsibility as individuals and societies to foster compassion and vigilance.
Absolutely. The horrors of World War II and the Holocaust remind us of what's at stake when prejudice and authoritarianism go unchallenged. As we've explored here, these events were rooted in ideologies that grew over time, showing how small seeds of division can grow into devastating outcomes.
And on that sobering but vital note, this concludes our exploration of Hitler's rise, the totalitarian regime he imposed, and the war that changed the world forever. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, remember, history's lessons are there to guide us.